Good morning. It is the 11th of March, 2024. And a quick housekeeping note here. I've got today's news video, which will be live in about an hour, be available to the public in about an hour from the time that I'm broadcasting this. It's a follow-up to that story I did on Saturday, the one that was really hard to report on. So keep an eye out for that. You won't want to miss that story, I promise you. And you probably have been aware the reports of Francis not being in the best physical shape he could possibly be in. I mean, you have to be aware of that. Everybody in the world knows about that. That he's frequently seeing his physicians and things to try to stay with us, basically. That he had a hard time getting into the Pope Mobile recently and all of these other sorts of things. And it's an interesting backdrop to these things, to what we're going to talk about today, because the last several months we've gotten a lot of these articles coming out about how Francis is the springtime in the church. Francis is the renewal in the church. I can't say it without. I'm going to try to say it while keeping a straight face while reporting on this stuff, because it's hard. It's very difficult to say something as silly as that. But there are forces doing this, and in some cases it looks like they're really sort of kissing up to the boss, but in others it's starting to almost sound like, well, like a eulogy almost. Late stage Francis pontificate sort of talk here, where these bishops are almost signaling, the modernist bishops saying this stuff are signaling that it's the end, and this is what we need more of. So let's go with the latest incarnation of this, which comes from Gloria TV. And I did look for the original source and I found it, and it's in Spanish and it's presented online in a way you can't exactly translate for this. We'll have to stick with the Gloria TV version. The headline is Francis, quote, is the springtime of the church. That's an odd take, that Francis himself is the springtime in the church. Springtime suggests a period of new life, a flowering, a fertile time. You would expect a springtime of the church to be characterized by an explosive growth in vocations to the priesthood and religious life. You would expect a springtime in the church to have RCIA classes bursting at the seams with young people. Perhaps a springtime in the church would have Catholics turning towards a more orthodox view of the faith. You wouldn't have high-profile Catholic politicians saying and advocating for the things that they do in America and other places. You would have scandals being cleaned up. You would have troubling bishops getting the justice through the church's legal system, and with their rights respected in as much as they have them. You would have problems taken care of in the church, is what I'm trying to say here. That's what a springtime in the church would look like, right? Maybe a proliferation of a whole bunch of clarification on doctrinal chaos that's been going on in the church, and maybe even an infallible declaration on some Marian dogma that has yet to be defined, but is still held by the church to be true, or some other issue. Instead, we're not having a springtime in the church. We're having we're still in a winter of the church, the post-conciliar winter, where the springtime never materialized. That's where we are. But you have this Monsignor Jose Manuel Lorca Planes saying otherwise. I want you to note something here. He is 74 years old. And the reason that's important is because when you hit age 75, on your birthday, you are expected as a bishop to submit your letter of resignation to the Holy Father, regardless of who that pope is. And he is free to accept or reject your letter of resignation. It's up to him entirely. It's not uncommon for a priest or a bishop's letter of resignation to be just ignored because the bishop is in good health and is completely capable of continuing in his ministry. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you would expect a bishop to continue in his role as an ordinary as long as he possibly can, right? The concept of a retired bishop is a very strange one. And it's easier to accept when the bishop isn't capable of doing his job anymore. But when they are in good spirits and good health and everything else, you would expect them to keep going for another few years if they can. right? So note the age here. It's important. So from the story. Monsignor Jose Manuel Lorca Planes, Bishop of Cartagena, Spain, has become the world champion in flattery. Speaking at the end of February in the Tertulia La Luz Forum, that's the Light Forum, brings to mind enlightenment and illumination and words that sound a lot like that. A place known for bringing together local public figures, he expresses boundless admiration for Francis. Without giggling, he described Francis as the springtime of the church because he has opened up many possibilities of hope. He has a great sensitivity. Perhaps it was not foolishness, but calculation that led Lorca Planes to utter this absurdity, since when he spoke of his own future, he expressed his willingness to continue, quote, serving God and the church even after his 75th birthday in October, reaffirming his commitment to his priestly vocation and his dedication to God's will. Referring to the Diocese of Cartagena, Lorca described it as one of the most vibrant in Spain. If this is true, Francis will be quick to dismiss him. For Francis, success is a sign of failure. All right, there's a possibility that the bishop said this stuff to just sort of, hey, I'm great. I love the Pope. Everything is great. Keep me in my job for as long as I can. Okay, Gloria TV's EN News is a useful source of information, but they have a very clear bias in everything they report there. And I actually appreciate them being upfront with it in the same way that I appreciate American Magazine not hiding their bias, or the National Catholic Reporter not hiding their bias. It's easier to use them as a news source if they are just very upfront with what their position is. And EN News doesn't hide this at all. I mean, when they say he said this stuff without giggling, meaning he said it without laughing, that he called him the springtime of the church, right? They're letting you know what their bias is, that this is funny. But this isn't the only one of this we've seen. We've seen a lot of this in the last few months. But let me give you another one here. Cardinal Ferell. You remember Cardinal Ferell? Kevin Ferrell. He was the roommate of Ted McCarrick, who was not aware of Ted McCarrick's hobbies, we'll call them, and his special interests. He was his roommate and didn't know all this stuff was going on, and he was shocked, I tell you, when this news about Ted McCarrick came out. This is from a few months ago. This is from about a year ago, actually. But this is, again, we were hitting the 10th year point of Francis's alleged pontificate. And this is a term we're going to keep seeing come up over and over again in the news, is that Francis is the renewal of the church. So their headline is Cardinal Ferell on Pope Francis's 10-year renewal of the church. In an interview to commemorate Pope Francis's 10-year anniversary as Pope, Cardinal Kevin Ferell, prefect of the Dicastery for Laity, Family, and Life, discusses a transformative decade distinguished by the Pope's teaching us how to live the gospel. You remember all the times the gospel said that people who disagreed with Jesus were like insects that ate animal droppings. You remember that? I must have missed that in the gospel, but that's how Francis said that about traditional Catholics and those of us who want the same faith as has always been taught. He just used it in much spicier language than I did there. But then again, Francis has a reputation for liking to use some strong language from time to time, and I try not to do that. But that's an example of maybe Kevin Ferrell here being a little more generous than is called for when he talks about teaching us how to live the gospel. The modernist interpretation of the gospel is essentially that parody of the gospel that we've seen from that Protestants hurl at us. Protestants will often say Catholics have a works-based faith. We believe that works are part of faith. They're an expression of the faith, that you cannot get to heaven without doing good deeds. After all, the Bible tells us that. But we don't believe you can work your way to heaven. You have to, rely on the grace of God and other such things. And the modernists have practically reduced the gospel to this works-based doctrine. We've seen this with how religious orders have been so-called reformed, how contemplative nuns are expected to go out and get their hands dirty and go work out in the margins and such, forgetting that the life of prayer that they lead, where they are spending their days in prayer, in addition to the works, the labor they're expected to engage in their in their convents to actually support their convents, because they are expected to do that, that the incredible amounts of prayer they do are an actual work of mercy. They are a spiritual work of mercy as opposed to the corporal works of mercy. The focus on the corporal works of mercy is a distortion of the gospel. Let's see what Cardinal Ferell has to say about this. He says, he's asked by his interviewer, the Holy Father has called for the laity to possess a greater role in the church, and women in particular. How has the Pope been bringing to fruition a new era, if you will, from this point of view? He says, I believe that our Holy Father, Pope Francis, made tremendous progress in the church and has changed in many ways the mentality of so many, both clerics and non-clerics. I think the laity feel much more comfortable within the structures of the church nowadays than they did 10 years ago when Pope Francis came into office. You feeling more comfortable within the structures of the church, ladies and gentlemen? Let me know in the comments. I believe that Pope Francis saw as his mission to continue the Second Vatican Council, the council that called the laity to be an active, not only participant, but member with all the rights due to baptism that every person in the church has. That was not so well known. Just making it up as we go along now. Very seldom did theologians speak about the rights invested in all people who were baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. I think he has done tremendously. He has named lay people all over the Vatican, meaning he's given lay people posts in the Roman Curia that previously had been held by, at the very least, priests, if not bishops and cardinals. And he's encouraged the laity to be involved. He called me here to Rome to help especially with the laity and to promote the laity within the church. You get the idea. This is the part here, though. He says, he's asked, as we approach this important anniversary, this would be the 10th anniversary of Francis's alleged election, how would you describe the transformation of the church brought about by Pope Francis during these 10 years of pontificate? He says, I think Pope Francis's greatest achievement has been to show us how to live the gospel of Jesus Christ. To me, that is it. He'll be remembered for that and teaching us all that we need to go out to the peripheries. It means we have to go out of our own comfort zone and engage with people. Pope Francis is the person most looked to teach us how the world should live. Do we all listen to him? No, but he has opened up the arms of the church to embrace the whole world. Not just Catholics and not just the good Catholics who go to church. All Catholics, all people, nobody excluded. And to me, that is the greatest thing Pope Francis has taught us in these years. I think my response to that is very basic. If he's done that, isn't that mean that he should be calling people to repent and to come home to the church, to actually enter the church? That is actually what that means. That would authentically, going out to the peripheries and going out to people and being welcoming to all people means that that anybody out there can become Catholic. There is no salvation outside of the church, after all. That is what we are told. Where is this church Father Ferell is? Cardinal Ferell is, I don't know, maybe that church is located in the same place that the person he thought Ted McCarrick allegedly was, person he told us Ted McCarrick was. Maybe that's where it is. Michael Keane says, Monsignor is confused that the Pope is the worst winter storm that has happened to the Catholic Church. Have to look at Spotlight movie again and see how far the church has come. What does it mean by Pope Francis's New Year renewal? I don't know. But this is what a lot of this strikes me as being a sort of, really focusing on the boss, right? Kissing up to the boss, that kind of thing. And we saw another one of these. Bishop Stow celebrates Pope Francis's renewal of peacemaking in the church. Peacemaking. I have that. This one's incredible because this was released in late 2022. We were still talking in late 2022 about Traditionis Custodes. We were getting wave after wave of Latin masses going down, and he's talking about he says, let's set aside liturgical battles. I'm like, oh, really? In the ressourcement versus aggiornamento interpretations, he talks about how because of Francis, we've become more familiar with the gospel. This is, again, the refrain we're getting is that Catholics know more about the gospel now because of Francis. And what does that say about Benedict? What does that say about John Paul II? If they are saying that we now have a greater understanding of the gospel than ever before, how to live the gospel, that's that's a gauntlet thrown down to those who have great love for Benedict XVI and John Paul II, and really any of the even and especially like the preconciliar popes. But he talks about all this stuff, but this is where I wanted to focus on here. He said, St. John 23rd also spoke a fatherly and pastoral word to the children of God and to Christian families on the eve of the council's beginning in his famous Moonlight Speech over St. Peter's Square. 10 years ago, as the 50th anniversary of that speech was being recalled, I remember pondering the words, when you go home, give your children a hug and tell them it's from the Pope. And when you find them with tears to dry, give them a good word. Give anyone who suffers a word of comfort. Tell them the Pope is with us, especially in our times of sadness. I mused at that time, imagining having a Pope who speaks like that. And 5 months later, we did. We again have a Pope whose smile has enchanted the whole world, whose actions and gestures speak even more loudly than his powerful words, and who's calling the church back to the fundamentals of the gospel, or as he puts it, the joy of the gospel. I'm going to pause here. This seems kind of funny to some of us, or to just being outlandish. That's how most Catholics see Francis. I know that might not be your personal experience. You may hang out with traditionally minded Catholics most of your time. But Francis is viewed in either sort of a dismissive, neutral way most of the time, and with kind of like this kind of a spin on it, or he is this, or they full-throatedly believe this about him. I know that's hard to wrap your head around. I know it is, but it's the truth. Francis is widely beloved by most Catholics. Those numbers are slipping. Fiducia Supplicans made sure of that. So did Amoris Laetitia and a few other things. And Francis's role in all the 2020 stuff, pretty big deal for that. But that's how most people view him. I want you to note a second thing here. This is the third time we've seen this. Back to this article. Pope Francis has left no doubt that the Second Vatican Council has charted the course for the Church and provided us with the appropriate image of a pilgrim people on the way to the kingdom. Like his smiling predecessor, Francis is attuned to the realities of the suffering of the innocent and painfully aware how the inequalities in access to and consumption of the world's goods have led to a disturbing lack of peace and the inability to humanity to live as sisters and brothers as God's plan has designed. It's a very loaded paragraph. Again, invocation of Second Vatican Council. Remember, Francis is, by his own admission, driven to what he says is complete Vatican II, complete the implementation of it. He and his particular wing of the modernists believe the Vatican II was never completed, that the council was closed officially, but the reforms were never fully implemented. What we see now are their reforms, as they understand them to be from Vatican II. That would include Fiducia Supplicans. That would include Amoris Laetitia. That would include this weird partnership with secular authorities. That is what they believe. And I mean, this whole paragraph is loaded with modernist language. You know, the church is an image of a pilgrim people on the way to the kingdom. Some of that stuff, right? Especially when you hear the language of the poor church. That's actually one of those condemned things from Pascendi and other warnings about the modernists, is that they want to essentially bankrupt the church and have it be a poor church that doesn't have all these external trappings of beauty. It's why after Vatican II, so many parishes were stripped of their ornamentation and turned into the very modern, bare bones kind of things that you see. I've not really heard Benedict referred much to as his smiling predecessor. Let me know if that's just my own personal fault thing there. I mean, I've seen pictures of Benedict smiling, but most of the images we have of Benedict are the image, meaning that how they present him to us was of, you know, the thinking pope, the sort of theological, philosophical pope, the problem, the macro problem solving pope, you know, the ideas pope, right? Francis is attuned to the realities of the suffering innocent and painfully aware. And then it goes into just materialism, materialism, materialism. And that is the most giveaway part of all of this. He is praised consistently by the modernists for his understanding of the problems of the world in a materialist sense. Materialism, Francis was, you know, when he's spoken about how not to lose sight of Christmas in the materialism that tends to predominate the season. He's not wrong about that. He's not wrong when he chastises the world for its focus on mostly economics and things. He's not really wrong about that stuff. The problem that comes into the play when that's all he ever talks about really is materialism, materialism, materialism. Again, it goes back to those nuns being told to, stop praying so much and go get your hands dirty, go out to the peripheries and do all that work. This contempt and hostility towards contemplative nuns. Contemplative religious are the prayer warriors for the church. We need more contemplatives doing more prayer, not less. The world would be in a better place with more contemplative nuns and contemplative monks doing what it is that they do. But unfortunately, that's not what the leadership of the church wants these days. Francis talking, him praising Francis for the rise of indifference. And indifferentism is a very big problem, but it's coming from the Vatican itself, from Francis. He talks, he's talking about indifference about the material condition of people, whereas the real indifference that we see coming from them is in their ecumenical dialogue. This Jesus is just the privileged path to knowing God. That Catholicism is the privileged path to knowing Christ. And that all these other ways are valid ways to know God and get your salvation. That stuff is the ultimate form of indifferentism, and it's the most dangerous kind because the consequences that are eternal. Material indifferentism, being indifferent to the suffering of other people in this world, is bad. It is evil. But the consequences for spiritual indifferentism are eternal for those that you're being indifferent to. As Catholics, we are called to bring them out of the darkness and into the light of that only comes from Christ, to bring them to the only place you can be saved. And that is something that the church has been out of the business of. So if this is what the springtime, this new renewal in the church looks like, maybe, I don't know about you, but I don't want any part of it. This new renewal, this new springtime in the church, I don't want any part of it. And yeah, Mike, I'm about to get to this part too. I changed the title of this one a little bit because I didn't want to focus so much on it. But Mike in the chat brings up my last point here, which is the Angelist from Sunday. It means a very strange take on our Lord's mercy and judgment. Jesus is not interested in putting us on trial and subjecting us to judgment. Right. So here, let me bring you to what he's talking about here. This was shared first, most widely from the Pontifical Academy for Life, where they just quote Francis. Jesus is not interested in putting us on trial and subjecting us to judgment. He wants none of us to be lost. Well, and that's great, except we all know that if you've ever read the actual gospel, if you've read the creed, Jesus will come back to judge the living and the dead. And we all will stand before Jesus as he is the supreme judge at our own personal end. Francis has helped promote the idea of universal salvation. He's never come out quite and said universal salvation is a thing, but he's helped promote the idea through his actions, through the ecumenical dialogue, and through this indifferentism, the Abu Dhabi Declaration, and all these other things that undermine the gospel. He has done that himself. Rich Reho, who has a surprisingly large following on Twitter, and I don't know why, says, Jesus is not interested in putting us on trial or subjecting us to judgment. He wants none of us to be lost. That's true. Think of us who very often condemn others, many times who like to speak badly, to go in search of gossip against others. Right. So, you get a little bit dig at his critics there. I'll put a link to that, to the actual full text of what Francis actually said in today's show notes, returntotradition.org. When I get those show notes up, they were from his Angelist. It's very short. I mean, that's how long it is. The thing about it to remember is these days Francis is barely giving his own Angelist addresses anymore. And I tend to think he'll be around for a while, but I think we're entering now for him the stage that John Paul II was in towards the end for several years, where John Paul II's various ailments and age were catching up to him on a very visible level. And I think we're at that stage now with Francis. JP2 was there for a while with that. And I think Francis will be here for a while with that too. But yeah, his address, his Angelist address, was weird. It was another one of those borderline heretical again, because Jesus will come to judge the living and the dead. I say that he's not interested in it is weird, because it's part of who Christ is the judge. In his earthly ministry, he chose not to judge. It was not the purpose of his earthly ministry, but he will judge the living and the dead. Do I have an update on the apostolic visitation? No, I do not have an update on them. I haven't heard anything. I have an email in my inbox. It might be from you, for all I know about them. I have 990 emails in my inbox because people keep misusing my email address to the point where I'm thinking about switching my email address out to something else and then not advertising it because people keep misusing it. Sand Hermit says, I think of the contemplative branches of the church and how it seems that the Pope wants to get rid of it. They're the prayer warriors. We need more prayers, not less, and everyone has a specific job. Yes. Yes, we need more of that. Gregory says, it's nice to know that the Pope knows exactly what Jesus thinks. I'll stick to scripture and tradition. Thank you very much. Yeah. David Wilson says, then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. Again, yeah, Jesus as judge is in the Bible. It's very, very clear. Virginia says, I think he means Pope John the 23rd when he talks of smiling predecessor, because he started Vatican II was called a smiling Pope. Right, but when you use the word predecessor, you typically mean the guy who came before you immediately. Yes, John the 23rd was a predecessor of Francis's, but the distance between their papacies is like 50 years, 55 years. Oh, Sheehan. Yep, that was you. Okay. I haven't heard anything from them. I will be doing a follow-up on something else tomorrow, more closer to home, I think. But yes, Richard is right. Please hit the like button. It would greatly help. DIY Queen, I can't speak to that. I have no ability whatsoever to make such judgment calls on that. All right, folks. And if there are any final thoughts in the chat, this is your time to get them in. Otherwise, we will wrap this up. Again, you will want to check out the news video I have for you today. It is a follow-up to that very difficult story I reported on from Saturday. You will want to check that out. It goes live about 25 minutes from the time where I'm recording this. Rosary Joven says in the chat, as days pass by, Lefebvre's words seem to be fulfilled. That is true. There's a reason I do feature him every few months, one of his homilies on my channel. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.